Hello, Merry Christmas and welcome to my session for this year's Festive Tech Calendar. My name's Sam Cogan and today we're going to talk a bit about Azure Managed Applications, the Service Catalog and how you can use these to deliver complex applications and Azure infrastructure to your users in your organization. If you don't know me, as I mentioned, my name's Sam. I'm a solutions architect and an Azure MVP, and I talk a lot about things like infrastructure as code, DevOps, automation, and general cloud infrastructure and cloud native technologies. You can find me on my blog at samcogan.com. You can find a whole set of videos on YouTube at youtube.com/samcogan, where I talk a lot about infrastructure as code in particular and some great material if you're trying to get started there. And then on Twitter and GitHub, where you'll find all the sample code for this session as well. So let's get started and talk a bit about, first of all, what are managed applications and what is the Service Catalog and why would we want to use it? So you might be familiar with the Azure Marketplace. This is where you can go and you can buy custom solutions that are set up for Azure. And some of these are of this particular type called Azure Applications. So Azure Applications are what we call managed applications, and they're a way for independent software vendors, ISVs, to package up sets of Azure infrastructure plus their custom applications and all those sort of things and deliver them to customers. So you can see we've got some here. We've got some Microsoft managed applications for things like Entra ID protection, but we've got some third-party ones, things like Snowflake, Fortinet, lots of different things. These are a way that you can deliver those applications to customers who you want to sell your solution to. But what we want to talk about today is actually how to use this approach to deliver applications to your internal users. And you'll see why in a minute. Now, you can absolutely deliver applications to your internal users through the Azure Marketplace, but I wouldn't recommend it. There's a lot of hoops you have to jump through. You have to set up partner accounts, you have to get validation and so on, when there is a better way of doing that, and that is the Azure Service Catalog. And the Service Catalog is essentially a way of having a mini sort of marketplace or catalog of your applications that you can deliver to your internal users without going through some of those hoops in a much easier fashion. And so the scenario we're going to talk about today, and it's worth understanding this as to why you go down this route. So we're going to talk about a scenario where we want to deliver AKS clusters to our developers. We want the developers to be able to deploy AKS clusters to do their dev work against and spin those up, do some work, tear them down again. Now, obviously, they can go into the Azure portal if we allow them to. They can go and click New and do an AKS cluster. But that comes with some defaults and some security settings and so on that maybe aren't aligned with our company requirements. So what we're going to create is a service catalog, which is for deploying an AKS cluster. And it allows us to firstly define a load of those settings that need to be configured for our corporate security standards or compliance or whatever. But it also allows us to hide a lot of the complexity. So at the end, the developer doesn't need to know about the intricacies of how you deploy an AKS cluster. They need to use our service catalog to do that. We'll ask them a few questions, and at the end of it, they'll get an AKS cluster at the end of it. Now, this is the kind of example we're going to use for the rest of these demos, but that's not the limit of what you could do to this. So there's a lot of uses for the service catalog. Self-service provisioning for developers and so on is one of them. But another great example is if you need to be able to spin up demo applications for your sales team to use when they go out to customers. You could do that as a service catalog entry. If you needed to actually deploy applications that you're going to sell to customers but manage internally and you don't want them involved in the provisioning process, you could also use the service catalog for that. There's lots of different use cases. So this is one I prepared earlier. We're going to have a look at how they work in a moment and put one together, but I've got one set up here. So I've got this AKS 041. I can give it a better name. We've got this display name as well. So if we click on this, what we can then do is we can go and click on deploy from definition. And this takes us through the deployment process. And you'll notice this looks very similar to how you would deploy any other application in Azure. So you're using the Azure UI, but we're defining what goes into this UI and what settings we ask for. So this front page, which is kind of the basic settings, is actually mostly defined by Microsoft. So we don't influence this one. So this is where we select a few basic things. So we're picking, the resource group that the managed app's going to deploy into. So we've got a demo resource group here. The region we want to deploy to, the application name, I'll just call that AKS cluster 01, and then the managed resource group. And I'll talk about that in a moment. This is a separate resource group where all our resources go to. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. But if we go to the next page, this page has been entirely defined by me. So these are the questions I'm asking my end user about how they want their cluster to be deployed. And so we can give it a cluster name. We can give it how many nodes we want. We can pick the size of the VM, and you'll notice here that I'm using a VM size picker. So you're not limited to just using text boxes. You can use any of the UI elements, and again, we'll go into more detail on this in a minute. But I can pick from the size picker. So we'll pick a DS3v2, and I want some 32 gig disks. And then it's going to go and do the usual confirmation that I can click create, and that'll deploy my cluster. So you can see there, I asked the end user some really simple questions, very few questions they needed to answer, and we can then deploy an AKS cluster at the back of that. Let's go and see how that works. But first of all, let's go and look at how you actually create a package for use with managed applications. So all a managed application is, whether you deploy it to the marketplace or the service catalog, is a zip file. And inside that zip file, you have 2 or 3 files. You have an ARM template, which defines the infrastructure you want to deploy. This needs to be called main-template.json, and that's where all of your actual infrastructure that is going to get deployed by Azure goes into. So it's pretty much a normal, plain ARM template. You then have a file called create UI definition, which is where you define how that UI looks. That's where you set up all that Azure portal UI and how then the interface you want to give to the customer. And then you have an optional view definition file, which defines the UI for the page you get once the managed application is deployed. And we can have a look at that in a bit. You don't have to have that. You can take the default on that and not use it. And so once we upload and deploy that package, you need to kind of understand a concept of that managed resource group that we meant before. So when you deploy a managed application, what you get is a top-level managed application that gets created in the resource group that you've told it you wanted to deploy into. And that's this little icon here with a box and a hand underneath it. It's just an Azure object for that managed application. What then secondly gets created is what's called this managed resource group. And so this resource group is attached to the managed application, and it's where all of your Azure resources that your managed application defines go. And you may have already seen something like this with some of the Microsoft pieces. So if you've ever deployed an AKS cluster, which is a good example, you'll note that it deploys the AKS cluster within the resource group you tell it. But you then get a second resource group that you had you didn't define it yourself, that gets deployed with the AKS nodes in and so on. That is the managed resource group for AKS. That's managed by Microsoft, but in this case, we are using this for our managed application. So it creates this resource group and it puts the resources in it. If you delete the managed application, it will then delete that managed resource group as well. So it cleans that up for you. There are also some things you can do to limit permissions on the managed resource group. This is mostly aimed at the ISV piece when you're deploying to a customer, but you can use it for the service catalog. And it's one of only 2 ways within Azure that you can actually get deny assignments applied onto a resource group. The other one is blueprints, which I'm going to cover here. But you can define that this managed resource group is locked down so that people only have read access on this resource group, except for a list of people or groups that you define that can have the rights to manage this. So if you want to be able to deploy some resources that maybe you've got a team that manages this particular application, you're going to let anyone deploy the application within your company, but they can't fiddle with the resources. If they have a support issue, they can raise that with the application team, who will have rights to go and manage the resources in this managed resource group, but only they have the actual rights to edit those, and everybody else has read access. You don't have to use that. You can turn it off and you can have normal Azure permissions apply. There's no deny in place, but if you want to, you can use that facility. Okay, so that's enough about how that all works. Let's get started by seeing how do we actually define the managed application. So we'll hover over the VS Code. And the first thing you'll notice is I'm using Bicep. So I mentioned before that you need to use an ARM template. You need an ARM template in the zip file that you deliver to Microsoft to create the managed application in your service catalog. But you don't have to write it in ARM template, and I would very much recommend you don't. So you can write all of your deployment code in Bicep. And all we will do is we'll compile that Bicep into an ARM template and put that in the zip file when we're ready to do that. You never have to look at the ARM template, look at the code in it. You can write it all in Bicep and just compile that when you're ready and upload that to the service catalog. That works just fine. So I recommend you stick with using Bicep for that. And this is a pretty simple Bicep file. You can go as complicated as you want. You could have Bicep over multiple files and use modules and all that sort of thing. It will all compile into a single ARM template, so that's fine. And we've got a very simple one here though. So we're asking for a few parameters, and you'll notice those parameters are the ones I asked for on the UI. So cluster name, node count, node size, OS disk size, and location. And then we're deploying basically a few prerequisites, so mainly just a virtual network and a subnet that we need to deploy AKS to. And then we're deploying the actual cluster here. This is an AKS cluster, and we're defining a couple of things that we're basically saying these are our company standards that you need to abide by, which is the reason why you need to use this service catalog deployment. So we're enforcing that you need to use the paid tier for AKS because we want support for that. We're turning on system assigned managed identity. We're turning on the OIDC issuer, and we're enabling RBAC and turning off public network access. So those are some of our defaults. We want every developer who's using this to have their cluster set up in that way. And so we're enforcing that by making them use the service catalog to do that. They don't have to go in and figure out how to enable all those things. They just have to go and use this service catalog. So that's the Bicep. There is nothing special about this Bicep compared to normal Bicep. The Bicep has no concept of it being a service catalog. You just need to make sure that you define all the resources you want and you set the parameters so that you have the right parameters you need to feed in from the UI into your Bicep code. And I mentioned UI. You don't actually have to use the UI to deploy service catalog. You can deploy a service catalog item using CLI, PowerShell, another ARM template, Terraform as well. And they'll just obviously use the same parameters. You can absolutely do that. So that's pretty standard. The next bit is this create UI definition. And this is where you define what the UI looks like. And unfortunately, this doesn't have a nice Bicep option. It's not really ARM template either, but it is all JSON. And it can be a bit verbose, but there is a way to make your life easier with this, which is to use the UI sandbox. So if we hop on over to the browser again, so there is this UI definition sandbox where you can go into the Azure portal and it gives you documentation and all of the UI elements that you could possibly use for this UI. So you've got the standard text box, but you've got things like file uploads, key vault certificate selector, storage blob selector, all stuff like that. So there's a few different options. And if you click on them, it'll take you to the docs, but you can also click this copy option and then you can add it into the UI here. So you can copy and paste, so on. And you can basically set up your UI in here. And when you're ready, you can hit preview and it will show you what your UI is going to look like. So you don't have to go through the whole process of writing the JSON in VS Code, setting up your zip file, uploading it, and then testing it out. You've got a more interactive way of doing that here. And you can go through and set that up and test it out to your heart's content. So I'd very much recommend you do that because the first time you use this, it's not the most straightforward thing in the world. Go back to our UI we've got here and let's walk through a few things here. So the first thing is you've got this basics tab. So I mentioned before that basic tabs is the one where it's asking you for things like resource group, location, and so on. And those are the defaults that Microsoft have defined to go on that tab. I've just basically referenced it here and left it empty, so I'm taking those defaults. You can add things to the basic tab if you want to. You can change things there and so on, but I'm not doing that here. I'm just adding it here primarily so I have a way to reference it later. Then you have this steps section. And those steps, if we go back to the browser and go to preview, the steps relate to these tabs. So each of these tabs, sorry, not the review and create, but the storage settings and the tags one is a step. We've got in here a step and it's an array of steps, and we've got this one step, which is this AKS settings one you remember from the UI. And then you've got an elements array which defines each of the elements that are on that page. And so I've got a couple here. So we've got the text box asking for the cluster name, and we've got a constraint that's required. We've got the node count, which is asking for how many nodes you want. And we've got a couple of constraints. Firstly, it's required. Secondly, we've added a regex to basically make sure that people can only put numbers in that box, and a validation method if that regex isn't complied with. We have the node size, and for that, instead of using the text box, we're using the Microsoft.compute.size selector. Some settings there. Firstly, for recommended sizes. So these are kind of the ones that get highlighted. This is the default that came from the UI. Probably need to change this actually because the AKS requires a minimum of, I think, 4 cores. So the D2 and the D1 are actually going to work. But ignore that for now. Constraints, we could have a constraint that would define the allowed sizes, and we probably should there to remove the 2 core machines. But we don't there, so that allows any sizes. A few options we've set. And then this OS platform one, we should actually probably change that to Linux as well because it's the AKS nodes need to be Linux really. It doesn't really matter from our perspective because we just need the size, but you can see you've got some options there. And then lastly, we've got the AKS OS disk size, which is another text box, and again, limited to adding numbers in as well. So those are the options we've defined on the UI. And then the last bit is where we create outputs from this page. And effectively what we're doing here is we are mapping values from the UI to those parameters. So you'll notice each of these parameters lines up with the parameters that are here. So we're basically saying, put the location, and this one's a bit special because this comes from the basic tab, so you don't have to use the steps. The same for the resource group one. Those are kind of the Microsoft syntax to get those, but we're saying put the location in that location parameter and the resource group name in that resource group name parameter, which I actually think I got rid of because I don't need it, so it's not actually, that one actually isn't needed anymore. Get rid of that. And then for the rest of them, these are coming from the steps, AKS setting step, and then the values. And that we're putting those into those parameters. So that's how you map what's in the UI to what's in the main template. If you were deploying your service catalog entry using something like the CLI or a Bicep template itself, obviously you wouldn't use this UI. You would be mapping your own values into these parameters. But that's how the UI one works. Lastly, in here, we've got this view definition file. And now this is optional, as mentioned. And all this does is it defines what you see on the page that gets created after you deploy a managed application. So actually, let me just hop over to the browser and show you what that looks like so it makes some sense. So you can see here, we've got a couple of service catalog entries or managed applications deployed. These two here, you see with the little box and hand icon. And if you click on that application, it will take you to a page. This one actually didn't deploy properly, but you can see the gist here. This is the page for the object. And within here, you can manage what goes into that page. So you see here it says, welcome to your managed application. You can define what it says there. You can do a few bits and pieces. You'll see in here, this shows me the managed resource group. So I can click on this managed resource group and it's only got the VNet currently deployed, but those are the Azure resources. And you can see that's what is deployed. And actually, if you look in the essentials page, there is this managed by field. And this shows me that it's managed by that managed application. So there's kind of a two-way piece there. Back over in VS Code, I'm defining, basically, instead of saying welcome to your managed application, it's saying welcome to your AKS cluster and a bit of a description. You can edit that UI a bit. There's not massive amounts you can do on that page. There are a couple of other things. I'm not going to go into these here because they're a bit more advanced. You can do a couple of other things. So you can show some metrics on this page. So you can take metrics from within the resources that you've deployed and expose them on this sort of top level managed app page. So if you wanted a customer, internal or external, to be able to view some metrics about your resources, you could show them in there. You can also use what's called custom resource providers to actually add some custom components to your page. Unless you really need them, I wouldn't recommend looking at those because they're quite tricky to do. They involve a lot of work on the back end and they've been in preview for a very long time, but they're quite tricky to do. And so generally you wouldn't mess about with this page very much. You don't even have to include it. It's optional. You can take the defaults, but if you want to change some of those sort of UI elements, you can do that through the view definition. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and save those. And that's all we need. So we're ready to go with deploying that. So as I mentioned, you can't actually deploy the Bicep file. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to compile that Bicep file. Yeah, so we should be able to just do Bicep build and then a main template Bicep, and that should create that for us. Yep. So that's you can see now I've got the JSON file, which is just the JSON representation of that. I did get a couple of warnings. These are fine because basically say I can't find the type for them. I think possibly my extension's a bit old. They're fine, but the Bicep build does run the ARM template toolkit against this. If you actually have errors from the toolkit or things you're not abiding by, do want to fix those, because when you potentially upload that to the service catalog, certainly for the marketplace, it will validate those against the TTK. It might not do it for the service catalog, actually thinking about it now, but you probably want to fix those anyway. We've got now those files defined. We want to create a zip file, so we need to basically put the create UI definition, the main template.json, not the Bicep one, and the view definition if you have one, and we need to add those to a zip file. Once we've done that, we need to upload it somewhere to blob storage. To actually get it into the service catalog, you have to point to the service catalog at a blob in blob storage to be able to actually do that. So let's go over to the portal. All of what I'm going to do now, you could do via a script. You could write some PowerShell or CLI to do that, or any other automation. And if you're going to do this regularly, I would recommend you build some sort of automation to do this. You can have an Azure DevOps pipeline or a GitHub Action or stuff to do a lot of this work for you. But I'll show you the manual way for the moment to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to upload the file. So I've got a storage account set up for this just for this purpose. So we've got a container in here and this apps container, and we are going to upload the file. So if we go to upload, and you can just drag and drop or point it to a file. So I've got this app.zip, which we did from the one we just looked at. So we're going to upload that. And you see we've got app.zip here. And then we're going to need a URL with a SAS token. So these are secure. You've got to put them behind a SAS token. You don't want them open to the internet. So if you go click on the option and go generate SAS, and then we want to generate a SAS token and basically give it some details of what you need. You only need it during the upload process. You can make this nice and small. I'm going to change the time back. I've had some issues with SAS tokens not being valid for a little bit for some reason. So if you click that and click generate SAS token, and we should get this URL which includes the SAS token. So we're going to copy that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create our service catalog. So again, you can do this through CLI or ARM template or whatever. We're going to use the UI just so it's easier for me to show you how that works. Okay, so we click new and define the resource group, which is where the definition of the service catalog entry is going to live. So we're just going to stick it in there. Give it a name. So we'll call this AKS. The region, and again, this is just a region where you're going to store the definition. You don't need to worry too much about that. Your users can pick different regions if you allow them to. We need to give it a name, a display name, and you can add a description as well. Right. So next page, we need to give it the package file URL. That's where we stick in the blob storage URL that we talked about a moment ago. So put that in there, and then we need to select the deployment mode. So if you're not familiar with this, ARM templates have two modes of deployment, complete and incremental. Complete assumes everything in the resource group is managed by the ARM template. So if there are things in there that aren't in the ARM template, it will delete them. If there are things that need to be changed, it will change them, and so on. The incremental deployment mode just basically adds on to what's already there. So if you've got other things in there or someone makes manual changes, it won't necessarily do anything about those. We're going to use complete. Be aware there are some issues with complete in some scenarios, particularly the one that jumps out at me at the moment is private endpoint. Private endpoint, when you create the private endpoint object in Azure, it automatically creates for you some network cards that go along with that. They're not in the ARM template. And so when you rerun this, it picks that up and sees that they're not there and tries to delete them, which causes all sorts of problems. There is a way to get around it by actually defining the NIC. Last time I looked, it was in preview, so it's not great, but you can get around that again by using the incremental mode. So it depends on your workload. So next page, there are a couple of things you can define. So the first one is the allowed actions. So I mentioned you can lock down your resource group so that it's read-only to everyone using a deny assignment, except for people that you define who can manage it. You can then actually override that deny assignment and add some specific rules that anyone can do beyond read. So if you did have a need to lock it down, but you wanted to do something else. So a common one is you want to lock down the resource group, but you need to allow your users to peer another network to it. And to do that, you need to have peering permissions on both sides, including the network that's in your managed resource group. So you could add a permission in here for the peering control and nothing else. These use the standard RBAC permissions, so you can basically just list the permissions you want to allow to override your deny assignment if you're using the deny assignment. If you're not, just leave it blank. The second one here is notification endpoint. So you can have the service catalog send a webhook message to a given URL that you provided at certain points during the life cycle of the process. So it will basically send you a webhook when the deployment starts, when the deployment finishes, when the deployment fails, and when the user deletes the managed application as well. So if you needed to perform other actions that occur outside of the actual managed resource group, you can do that using the notification endpoint. The authentication and lock level is what I mentioned before. So this is defined if you want normal users to have read-only access, or you can set the none, and that means no lock level, so they can do whatever they have normal RBAC permissions. They won't be hit by the deny assignment. And then in here, in this list here, you can add members where you can define which users actually do have management rights over that resource group, and you can grant them certain roles to be able to perform those roles once the deployment's finished. We're going to leave it at none, and then we go to review and create, and that just gives you the normal summary screen, and we'll say, yes, we want to go ahead and create that managed app definition. That's now completed, so if we go to resource, it'll take us to our definition, and there's not a lot to view on the definition. It's basically just a summary of what you've got there, but the key bit is either this deploy button or the deploy from definition one, which will start that wizard for you. And that takes us back to the page we saw earlier on, where you've got this basics page to define where you want to deploy to, resource group, region, name of the managed resource group, and so on. And then on the next page, we've got our custom options that we defined in that create UI definition. And then we can go ahead and deploy that. And then what you get out at the end of it is this managed application that we've deployed. And as before, it's got this managed resource group option. If we click on that, you can see that we've actually got the AKS cluster along with the VNet defined. You can go and look at those as normal. I don't have any deny permission on here, so I can go and use that as required. But any resources that you deploy would be in here. And then the nice thing for cleanup as well, so if I as the end user don't want those resources anymore, particularly if you did have a deny permission, I can't go into the managed resource group and then go and delete them in here if I have a deny permission. But I can go to the top level AKS demo 04 object and I can click delete, and that will delete the managed application, but it will also delete any of the resources that were created by it as well, leaving that nice and clean. So the end user can still manage the life cycle of those resources, but if you want to, you can lock down so they can't actually manage the underlying resources as well. For something like a dev AKS cluster we talked about here, then you probably do want the actual developers to be able to go in and fiddle with that. But for something like a demo application you're giving to your salespeople so they can deploy it, demo it to clients and then delete it, you probably don't want them fiddling with it because they'll probably break it and it won't work for their demo. So you can lock that down so they can't do that. But at the same time, your team can support it if there is a real issue with it. That could be quite useful in that type of scenario. And that's it. The service catalog is a fairly simple concept, but you can make some really complicated applications in there if you want to, particularly if you start using those webhooks and you can trigger events that occur after your Bicep file, sorry, your ARM template that we created with Bicep is deployed. You can then make it really complicated and call into other services, have other things happen. You can be as complex or as simple as you want, but it can be a really powerful tool and not something that everyone perhaps knows about. So hopefully this has given you some insight into what the service catalog is, what managed applications are, and why you might want to use them as an internal tool rather than thinking that they're perhaps just a tool for the Azure Marketplace that can be quite complicated. As you saw, getting a service catalog application deployed is really quick. There is no review process or partner center process or anything like that you have to go through for the marketplace. It's a very quick process to do that. It also means if you are actually developing a managed application to go into the Azure Marketplace, using the service catalog as a means of testing that application and developing it before you go to the marketplace is actually really useful as well because it's a much quicker feedback loop. And that's it for my session today. So I hope you found that useful. I hope it's something you'll go away and play with. And I really hope you'll go and enjoy all the rest of the Festive Tech Calendar sessions as well. And I hope you have a great Christmas and a Happy New Year.